Arizona Territory, 1879. Dust rose in golden sheets as the stagecoach tore around the bend, and Helena Hayes clutched the edge of her seat, heart pounding harder than the hooves beneath her. "Faster," she shouted to the driver, her wedding veil torn and tangled in the wind. Behind them, two riders closed in faces half-covered, rifles glinting. The air smelled sharp with gunpowder and desert heat. The driver cracked his whip again. "Hang on, miss. Helena didn't belong here." She was supposed to be married by now, standing under the cottonwoods in Bisbee with a man she barely knew but had agreed to marry for her father's sake. But the ceremony had never happened. Not after the Holton gang stormed the ranch house and shot her fiancé in cold blood. She had escaped through the back door in her wedding dress, leaping onto a horse and riding until she found the stage. Now she was running again. The stagecoach jumped, a wheel catching rough ground. Helena slammed against the side, biting her tongue to keep from crying out. She glanced behind too late. One of the outlaws raised his rifle. A shot cracked through the air. The driver slumped forward, reins loose in his hand. The horses screamed, veering off the road. Helena grabbed the rail, bracing herself as the whole coach tipped sideways and tumbled into a dry wash. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Then everything went still. She crawled out of the wreckage, dress torn, knees bleeding. The outlaws were dismounting now, walking slow, casual, like they had all the time in the world. She stumbled backward toward the brush, breathing hard. "Don't make it harder than it has to be," one of them called out. "You're common with us." "No," she said, voice shaking but firm. A second outlaw raised his gun again. Then came the sound of a rifle firing, not theirs. The closest outlaw dropped. The second turned, startled, and another shot rang out. Both men fell, dust curling around them like smoke. Helena turned, heart hammering. A tall man on horseback emerged from the rocks, rifle still raised. Sun caught the edge of his jaw, the edge of his hat. He looked down at her, his features sharp, his eyes steady. "You all right, miss?" She tried to speak, but her throat was raw. She nodded. He dismounted in one motion, boots hitting the sand. His horse was a strong bay, saddlebags full, like he had been riding a long time. He walked right up to her, calm and measured, and offered his hand. She stared at it a moment before taking it. "I'm Zachary Callen," he said. "Most folks call me Zach. Helena Hayes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked her over. "You hurt? Just scraped. Can you ride?" "Yes." She glanced back at the wrecked stagecoach, at the bodies. They were chasing me. They killed my fiancé." "They were going to take me." Zach nodded slowly. "Then we best keep moving. Holton's gang doesn't quit easy." It was not a question. He already knew who they were. He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his arms braced around her to take the reins. She tensed at first, but there was something steady in the way he held her, something safe. They rode fast through the desert, the last sun slipping behind the mountains. By the time Zach pulled them into a narrow canyon, night had fallen. He set up a fire in a small hollow, tucked away from sight. Helena sat on a flat rock, arms wrapped around herself. Her dress was ruined, her hands trembling. Zach handed her a tin cup of water before sitting a little ways off, watching the fire. "Why were you out there?" she asked after a while. "Heading north," he said. "Got land near Prescott. Thought I'd see it before winter. You saved my life." He looked over at her, quiet for a moment. "You looked like you needed saving." The fire crackled between them. She studied his face, sun-darkened skin, a faint scar at his jaw, lashes thick above steady eyes. He didn't look at her like she was fragile, just like he saw her. "I was supposed to be married today," she said, voice rough. "They shot him before we even said the vows." Zach's expression didn't change. "You cared for him." "No, not really. My father arranged it." "But he didn't deserve to die." "No, he didn't." She looked down. "I do not know what to do now." Zach stood and walked to his saddlebag. He pulled out a clean shirt and a wool blanket. "Here," he said, offering them. "You need sleep. We'll ride at first light." She took them slowly. "Thank you." He nodded and turned away, laying his bedroll a few feet from the fire. Morning came cold and early. Helena woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sound of Zach saddling the horse. "You sleep?" he asked as she sat up. "A little. We'll ride west," he said. "I know a place where they will not find you. For now." She stood, brushing sand from her legs. "I do not want to keep running." Zach looked at her for a long second. Then we will not run, we will move smart. She helped him bury the fire and they rode again. The desert shifted around them, red rock giving way to low hills, then cottonwood trees along a narrow stream. By noon, they reached a small cabin tucked into the hills. It looked abandoned, but Zach pushed the door open like he had been there before. "My uncle built it," he said. "He passed a few years back. No one comes here." Helena stepped inside. The place was simple: one bed, a table, dust on everything, but it felt like shelter. That night, she helped him cook beans and cornbread over the fire. They sat close, knees almost touching. "You never said why you helped me," she said. Zach was quiet, then shrugged. "I have seen too many good folks die, could not ride past." She looked at him. "You are not like other men I have met." He gave a small smile. "That good or bad?" "Good." They sat in silence after that, but it was not uncomfortable, just warm. When she laid down that night, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, she stared at the wall and listened to the sound of his breathing across the room. Steady, strong. She felt safe for the first time in days. And for the first time in her life, she wondered what it would feel like to be wanted, not for her family name, not for her dowry, but just for who she was. Zach Callen had not asked for anything. He had not tried to touch her. He had only protected her. And part of her already wanted to stay. The sun broke gently through the cabin's lone window, casting soft gold over the worn floorboards. Helena rose slowly, her body sore from days of riding and nights on unfamiliar bedding. She pulled her hair back in practiced motions, her fingers moving without thought. The quiet around her was different from silence. It was peace, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Zach was outside, his shadow moving across the ground as he chopped wood. He worked without hurry, each motion steady and sure. She watched him a moment through the doorway, arms folded over her chest. The plain shirt he wore was dusted with sawdust, sleeves rolled past his elbows. His hat lay nearby on a stump. When she stepped outside, he paused, axe resting against his thigh. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she answered, voice clearer than she expected. He nodded toward the edge of the trees. "Stream's not far, you'll find clean water there." She glanced down at her hands, still marked from the wreck. "Thank you." He went back to splitting wood, and she followed the faint path he'd indicated. The land around the cabin opened into a sloping hollow, with pines standing tall at its edges. The stream ran clear and cold, weaving through stone and grass. She knelt to wash, the icy water biting into her skin, sharp and bracing. When she returned, Zach had laid out a small meal cornmeal mush, a few slices of dried apple and coffee brewed dark and strong. They ate on the porch steps, neither speaking for a while. The cabin behind them held no sound but the creak of its old frame and the wind nudging the shutters. Zach broke the quiet. "After we eat, I'll ride out. Need to check the trail south, see if there's any sign of riders." Helena looked up. "You think they'll still be following?" "Could be. Could be not. I'd rather know than guess." She hesitated. "You'll come back." His gaze met hers, calm and unwavering. "Yes," she nodded. That was enough. After he saddled up and rode off, the hours moved slowly. She swept the floor, wiped down the table, and took stock of the supplies. There was flour, salt, a few jars of canned peaches. Not much, but enough for a few days. She found a length of muslin tucked in a drawer and began stitching a simple work dress. Her wedding gown, now bundled in the corner, was no longer hers in any way that mattered. The needle moved through cloth in quiet rhythm, anchoring her to something solid. By mid-afternoon, Zach returned. Dust clung to his boots and cuffs, but his face bore no tension. "No tracks near the pass," he said, tying off the reins. "No smoke, either. If they're searching, they've gone another direction." Her shoulders eased. "That's good." He stepped onto the porch and leaned against the post. "You've done something with the place." She set the half-sewn dress aside. "Just needed order." He looked around the cabin. "Looks better for it." They went inside when the sky began to soften. She stirred beans over the stove while he mended a leather strap near the fire. Shadows lengthened across the floor, and the smell of sage drifted in through the open door. "You don't talk about where you're from," Zach said, not looking up from his work. "There's not much to tell," Helena answered. "My father owns land outside Misilla. He was a cavalry officer before that. You close. He's a man who knows duty. That's what he taught me." She paused. "I don't think he ever understood me much outside of that." Zach nodded once. Some people only know how to build walls. I used to think that made them strong, she said. Now I wonder, his hands stilled. You're not the same as when I found you. I'm still trying to figure out who I am now. But I know I'm not running anymore. Zach met her eyes. Good. They shared the meal quietly. Afterward, he stood outside while she cleaned the dishes. The light turned silver across the ridge and the wind picked up just enough to rustle the dry grass. When Helena stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee, she handed him one and sat beside him on the step. Do you ever get tired of being alone? She asked. His answer took a while. I don't mind quiet, but there's a difference between quiet and being empty. She sipped her coffee. I thought I'd feel free, losing the life I was supposed to have, but I just feel like I'm floating. You're not, he said. You've got your feet under you, even if it don't feel that way yet. She turned to look at him, the firelight from inside catching the lines of his face. Why do you talk like that? Like you know things you've never said? Zach set his mug down slowly. Because I've lived through things I don't always speak of, and I don't believe in filling the air just to make noise. She nodded, more to herself than him. That makes sense. The stars began to shine one by one. She didn't move to go in, and neither did he. I'm not afraid now, she said quietly. You don't have to be, he replied. She looked out at the dark hills, then back at him. I want to see the land you spoke of. The place you said was yours. You will, Zach said, voice low. When you're ready, we'll go. Helena closed her eyes for a moment. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting to be told what came next. She would choose it. And she was beginning to believe she wouldn't have to choose it alone. The wind carried the scent of dried pine and sun-warmed stone as they rode out of the canyon, the scrubland stretching wide beneath a pale blue sky. Zach kept the pace even, letting the gelding pick its way through the narrow trail. Helena sat behind him, her hands resting lightly at his sides, the new muslin dress she'd sewn tucked beneath a borrowed coat. The cabin had been quiet comfort, but she hadn't asked to stay. When Zach said it was time, she'd simply nodded. They rode westward toward higher country. The land began to rise, pinyon and juniper giving way to taller ponderosa, and the air cooled as they climbed. Around midday, they passed a small creek banked with tall grass, and Zach dismounted to water the horse. Helena stepped down carefully, brushing dust from her hem. How much farther? Another half day, Zach said, checking the cinch. We'll make it before dark. He didn't say what waited for them, only that it was land he'd worked once, before winter and grief had driven him away. She hadn't asked about the grief. Not yet. While the horse drank, Helena wandered a few paces off and crouched at the edge of the creek. The water ran fast over smooth stones, and tiny fish darted in the shallows. She reached in, letting it cool her fingers, then stood and turned. How long did you live up here? She asked. Zach looked out over the ridge. 5 years, give or take. Built a fence that never held, planted corn that never took more than once, but I stayed. What made you leave? He hesitated, then straightened. My brother died. Wasn't much reason to stay after that. She studied him. You were close. He was younger, wild, thought he'd live forever. He didn't. Zach's voice held no anger, just the shape of memory. After he passed, I couldn't look at the place without seeing him. Helena didn't speak, letting the silence settle between them. He met her eyes. But I kept the land, could never bring myself to sell it. She gave a small nod. That was never really about crops or fences, was it? No, it was about staying put, about belonging somewhere. They mounted again, and the day passed in steady rhythm hoofbeats, wind in the trees, the creak of worn leather. As the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, they crested a rise and the valley opened below them. It was quiet land, with a narrow meadow bordered by firs and a small cabin tucked into the slope. The roof sagged slightly, but the walls held. A split-rail fence ran crooked through the grass, and beyond it, a small paddock stood empty. Helena stared down at it. This is yours, it was, Zach said. Still could be. They rode the last stretch in silence, and when they reached the cabin, Zach dismounted and tied off the reins. He didn't offer a hand this time. She didn't need one. Inside, dust lay thick on the shelves, but nothing was broken. A few old tools hung from nails on the wall, and the hearth stood ready, as if waiting for fire. Zach opened a window and stepped aside to let in the light. We'll need to patch the roof before any real weather comes through. Helena set down her bundle. I can sew, I can cook, I'm not afraid of hard work. He looked at her. I know that. She crossed the room and opened the back door. A small lean-to stood behind the cabin, half collapsed but still offering shelter. Could be fixed up for livestock. You thinking of staying? He asked, his voice low. She turned back to him, her face clear. I'm thinking I haven't felt steadier than I do standing here. Zach stepped forward slowly, as if giving her space to change her mind. She didn't move. He reached out, his thumb brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You've got a strength most folks never find. I didn't have it before, she said. Not until you. She lifted her hand, touched his chest where his heart beat steady beneath the fabric. I want to build something, she said. With you. If you'll have me. Zach didn't speak, just leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The quiet held them, the weight of what had been chased behind them, the shape of what might come resting between them. I want that too, he said at last. She smiled, then not the practiced smile of polite company, but something real, something rooted. That night they lit a fire in the hearth, the first flames the cabin had known in years. They ate bread and apples, sitting close on the floor as wind moved through the trees outside. Neither spoke of the road behind them. They didn't need to. Tomorrow they'd clean out the barn. He'd cut new boards for the fence. She'd patch the roof and make the hearth a place for bread to rise. The land would take time, but they had time. And for the first time in both their lives, they didn't have to face it alone. By the third morning on the ridge, the wind brought the sharp promise of autumn. Zach stood at the edge of the paddock, adjusting the last of the new rails. The split-rail fence, once bowed and broken, now stood upright with lines clean and true. Helena stepped out of the cabin holding a tin of nails, a strip of muslin tied over her hair to keep the cold off her ears. You missed one by the gate, she said, nodding to the loose top rail swaying slightly. I was hoping you wouldn't notice, he replied, taking the tin from her hand. You've known me long enough to know I notice everything. He gave a short breath of agreement, then bent to hammer the rail into place. When it held, he leaned back and wiped his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. A pair of doves scattered from the pine boughs above them, wings flashing pale in the morning light. Helena turned toward the cabin. I boiled the last of the beans last night. We'll need to trap or trade soon. Zach straightened. You comfortable riding into town? She looked over at him. Is that your way of asking if I'm afraid? No, he said. It's my way of saying I'd rather not take you into danger unless you want to go. Helena studied the distant ridgeline. They'll be long gone by now. And I'm not hiding anymore. They rode out that afternoon, the trail narrow and rutted from late summer storms. The horse moved slower with both of them mounted, but neither minded. The silence between them had grown easy, filled with quiet glances and small gestures that needed no explanation. The town of Pine Bluff was little more than a mining stop nestled in the hills, a livery, a dry goods store, a boarding house, and the saloon with its warped porch slats and leaning sign. Zach tied the horse just outside the mercantile and helped Helena down. Inside, the shop smelled of dry flour and sun-warmed leather. A woman of perhaps 50 stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled to her elbows, spectacles perched on her nose. She looked up when they entered, her gaze lingering on Helena's coat. You're new, the woman said, not unkindly. Helena stepped forward. We live west of here, ridge above the third creek. That would be the Callen place, wouldn't it? Zach offered a nod. It's mine still, the woman's face softened. I thought you'd gone for good. I tried, Zach said. Helena moved to the small sacks of flour stacked near the window. We'll need 2 of these, and coffee if you've got it. As the woman packed the supplies, she looked across the counter. Winter comes early here. You'll want oil for that lamp too. We'll take it, Helena said. Then, as Zach handed over a few coins, she added, Do you know if any strangers have come through lately? Not in weeks, the woman replied. Just the same freight wagons and silver men. Why? No reason, Helena said. They left the store with saddlebags full, the supplies balanced carefully behind the saddle. As they rode out of town, Zach glanced over. You carry yourself different in town. I was raised to speak like I belonged in any room, she said. But I never did until now. They reached the cabin by dusk, the light slanting long over the western slope. After they stored the goods, Helena stepped out to the porch with a lantern and watched the first stars appear above the trees. Zach joined her, a wool blanket folded over one arm. "Cold's coming on faster than I expected," he said. She nodded, then looked up at him. "Have you ever thought about what it means, staying here for good?" "I have," he said, "but it feels different now." "How so?" He took a breath, then spoke slow. "Before, I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. Now I stay because I've got reason to." She turned fully to face him, the lantern casting soft gold across her cheek. "I'm not just passing through, Zach. I know." He stepped closer and held out the blanket without pushing it into her arms. She took it, draped it around her shoulders, but didn't look away. "I've worn a dress meant for someone else's life," she said. "I won't do it again." Zach's eyes didn't waver. "You won't have to." She didn't answer right away. Then she reached out, not hesitantly, and laid her hand against his chest. "I want to build more than fences with you," she said. The quiet held for a beat. Then he leaned in and kissed her, not as a promise made in haste, but as something solid and full of knowing. When they stepped apart, neither looked away. The wind shifted through the trees, and somewhere nearby, an owl called once, then fell silent. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. The mountain winds had begun to carry the weight of snow. By late October, the valley dipped into frost each night, and Helena's breath came in soft plumes over the kettle as she poured hot water for washing. Inside the cabin, the hearth glowed low from the morning fire Zach had banked at dawn. The days had taken on a rhythm, quiet, honest, and full. Zach stepped in from the barn, pulling off his gloves and rubbing his hands together. His coat carried the scent of cedar and horses. "Found a fox den by the east fence," he said. "Could be trouble for the chickens come spring." Helena dried her hands on her apron. "We haven't got chickens yet." "Still worth fixing the gap," he said. "No sense waiting for a problem." She folded the towel and hung it by the stove. "We could build a small coop near the lean-to. It'd keep them warmer." Zach nodded. "I can draw up something this evening." She looked at him for a long moment, then set the kettle down. "You always plan like you know we'll still be here next year." He met her eyes. "I do." She stepped closer. "That's not something I ever thought I'd want." "I didn't either," he said. They stood that way for a moment, the quiet between them warm as the fire. Then Helena reached for his hands, still red from the cold, and rubbed them between hers. "You've got a mark here," she said, touching the thin scar near his thumb. "Split it open on a wagon hook when I was 14, he said. "Thought I'd lost the whole hand." She traced the edge of the scar lightly. "You never told me things like that before. You've never asked. I'm asking now." Zach looked at her hands resting over his. "You want to know what kind of boy I was? I want to know everything you've carried." He exhaled slowly. "I was quiet, kept to myself. My mother used to say I had the eyes of someone older than I was. I think she meant it kindly." Helena smiled. "You were a boy who watched more than he spoke. That never really changed. I like that about you." He studied her face, then reached up and brushed a curl behind her ear. "You've changed more than anyone I've known." "I'm not sure I changed," she said. "I think I just stopped pretending." Zach looked down. "You ever think about what comes next?" She stepped back, just enough to see him clearly. "I think about waking up next to you tomorrow. I think about planting in the spring. I think about whether we'll have to share the creek with those raccoons again." He laughed, low and warm. "That's enough future for me." That night, they sat by the fire while snow started to fall, the flakes whispering against the cabin roof. Helena read aloud from a weathered book she'd found in one of the trunks left behind by Zach's uncle, her voice soft in the lamplight. Zach carved notches into a strip of wood, marking the days since they'd come back. When she finally set the book aside, he reached for her hand. "There's a preacher that winters in Willow Ridge," he said. "He comes through here every March." Helena tilted her head. "You're not one for ceremony, no," he said, "but I am one for promises." She looked at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "Then let's make one." They didn't speak more of it, not that night, but the understanding sat between them, solid and unshakable. The snow deepened over the next weeks. They worked side by side, splitting wood, mending window seals, and laying straw in the loft. On clear days, Zach hunted in the higher trees while Helena stitched thick quilts from flour sacks and scraps of wool. The valley held them close, the wind less of a threat and more of a companion. One blue morning in March, when the last of the snow melted into the creek and the ground softened underfoot, the preacher rode in on a mule with a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. Helena wore a blue dress she'd made from a trade bolt, and Zach wore his father's old vest. They stood beneath the bare-limbed aspen behind the cabin, the sun just warm enough to feel like promise. The preacher said a few words, simple and true. They exchanged rings Zach had carved from antler and polished for weeks. When Helena slid hers onto her finger, she looked up at him and said nothing but her eyes held every answer he'd ever needed. That night, after the preacher had ridden on and the stars had come out clear and bright, they danced once in the grass behind the cabin. No music, just the sound of wind in the trees and the hush of their feet on the soft ground. Zach held her hand against his chest. "You still sure?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I've never been surer of anything." Years passed. The coop took shape that first April, and by May, they had 6 hens and a rooster that never stopped crowing. Helena planted a small garden behind the cabin: turnips, onions, and beans. Zach built a smokehouse by the creek. In summer, they bathed in the shallows during the heat, and in winter, they rayed by the fire, shoulders pressed together. They never spoke of the day she fled in her wedding dress or the men who chased her. Some things did not need remembering to be understood. What mattered was the life they built in its place. They did not have many neighbors, but the ones they did had strong hands and quiet eyes. By the 3rd year, when Helena's belly rounded with their first child, the women came with baskets of broth and strong teas. Zach built a cradle from pine, carving her name into the side. Their daughter was born on a morning filled with bird call and sunlight. Helena held her close, and Zach sat beside them with both hands trembling and tears he didn't try to hide. They named her Clara, after Helena's mother. By the time Clara could walk, she followed her father to the barn and tried to carry feed buckets twice her size. Helena watched from the porch, heart full. They grew old slowly. Gray streaked Zach's beard first, then Helena's braid, but their hands stayed strong and their love never turned quiet. It deepened. Like the roots of the aspens they planted the year Clara was born, on their 25th winter together. Zach surprised Helena with a second ring, this one silver, with a tiny turquoise stone set in the center. "I never stopped choosing you," he said, sliding it onto her finger beside the first. She kissed his cheek, her voice soft in his ear. "And I never will." The cabin still stood, solid and warm, holding laughter and years like the rings in a tree. And every morning, when Zach rose and Helena stirred the fire, they looked at each other across the room and smiled like they were still dancing under that first March sun.